Hello, I'm Corinna Harrod and this is the Monday Night Review. Hello and welcome to episode 141 of the Monday Night Review. It could be episode 141. It's around there. I'm not entirely sure. Why am I not sure? It's 30 degrees and I'm British. Also, can you tell what I did? I did something that I've been meaning to do for a while, but I did it in a very me way. I bought a fancy new microphone, everybody. Yes, no more lapel mic for me, clipped to the end of a pencil and shoved in a pen pot. I got an actual proper microphone. But what I did was I got an actual proper microphone, the top of my budget, and quit my job the next day. It doesn't seem like the right way it should go, but it is the way it's gone. So hopefully the sound quality is better. I mean, what I really need is one of those tiny rooms covered in egg cartons. But, you know, I'm back in my office. It's hotter than hell. I've shut the door. I've got a new microphone. Let's celebrate the wins while we can. I have got a massive TV recommendation this week. I watched, and my husband watched, and he wanted to binge watch. There's only 3 episodes, and he was happy to do them all in one sitting. Mastermind by the story of Dr. Anne Burgess. It's basically a 3-part documentary about Dr. Anne Burgess, her life, her work, and she and it are just incredible. She is basically, you've probably heard of John Douglas, you might have heard of Robert Wessler, but you might not have heard of Anne Burgess, and without her, I don't think profiling would be what it is. They are the FBI guys. She is the science behind profiling. She gets the data and she's still going. She's 87 or something. She's still going. She's amazing. So if you like a documentary, it's interesting. There's murder stuff in it, but it's no Night Stalker documentary. She works on some very famous cases. What I would say, though I would prefer a different way to say it, but her speciality, I think, is sort of rape and sexual assault. That's where she first gets involved. She trains as a nurse, and then she becomes a professor of nursing, but she is one of the first people to identify how rape can really affect people at a time when it was just not even considered a crime. She, wanted to find out why these things happen, what the common denominators. She's just a massive data geek, I think, really, but with this incredible empathy and understanding, and really, I think she says quite early on in the documentary that people need someone to listen. And listening is something that is really helpful to people. And it's actually one thing I was saying to a friend before I watched this documentary is that I went to therapy once. And something that my family had all been telling me I was being really unreasonable about and being really grumpy about. And I told my therapist about it. And she was like, gosh, that sounds incredibly frustrating. And it was like someone popped a balloon. It was like, yeah, that's all I wanted. I just wanted someone to listen and tell me how frustrating that is and to get it. And I instantly felt so much better. And she sort of sees that from a victim's point of view. And it's just such a good watch. So it's called Mastermind. And it's about Dr. Anne Burgess. And she's a badass. And it's great. So that's my recommendation. Has anyone got any TV recommendations? I'd love to hear them. Today we are going to talk, but there's a trigger warning for suicide. We do talk about suicide in this, and it's a lot to do with gay hate crimes. So just a warning at the top. My source for this is a Telegraph magazine article with Steve Johnson from a couple of months ago, I believe. There's lots on the internet. Today we're going to talk about the death of Scott Johnson. So it all starts on Friday the 10th of December 1988, the morning after a massive storm in Sydney Harbour, Australia. And a man called Brian Butson, his friend Paul Patterson, and Paul's 13-year-old son Stephen are going spearfishing along the rocks below the North Head Cliffs in the beachside suburb of Manly, 20 minutes north of Sydney. And I believe this is something they'd done before. It's so Australian, isn't it? Just going to go out spearfishing. I'm sorry. I've lived with Australians for 3 months. I can't not do an Australian accent. The North Head Cliffs tower, they're really high, 14 stories high, and Stephen yells that he's found a body. Now, Paul and Brian say, no, it's probably an animal. But they go over to have a look, and they see that it's a naked adult male. And it's quoted in the Telegraph magazine as fragments were strewn around and seagulls picked over the remains. It sounds really distressing to find. But it's a well-known jumping point. So I believe Paul Patterson goes to get help from the police station and says they've found the body of a jumper. And the police arrive. And when Dr. John Duflo, is that it? Duflo, the pathologist works on the body, he says, quote, "It was always a routine case. It was approached as a suicide from the beginning." And I think that's a really interesting thing to say, isn't it? Because even that first assumption can affect everyone else's view of the case. If someone came running into your house and said, someone's just run in front of a car, we need you to come and help, then for the rest of the time, your thoughts are going to be, that person ran in front of a car, when in fact a car could have mown someone down deliberately. But because of the way it was told to you, and I think that's a very interesting way that this story has been flagged. Police officer on duty, Constable Troy Hardy, who was 24 at the time, arrives on the scene at around 11 a.m. and he agrees, clear case of someone jumping from the cliffs above. A helicopter comes to take the body to Manly Hospital, and Hardy, Butson and 2 other policemen go up to the top of the cliffs to see if they can find the spot where the man has fallen. And around 10 metres from the edge, they find a pile of clothes, very neatly folded, which causes me problems later on. Blue trousers, long sleeve shirt, underwear, Adidas trainers, neatly folded. There's no note, which is interesting. There's also no sign of a struggle. There's no scuffing near the cliff edge or anything like that. They do find a student ID, and that ID gives the name Scott Johnson. And the address on the ID is in Canberra. So they send police to that address. No one's home. And they call and leave a voice message. And the home turns out to belong to musicologist Michael Noon. And initially he says that they're friends and Scott has been staying there. And then when it turns out exactly what's happened, he admits that Scott and Michael are in a romantic relationship. Remember, this is the 80s in Australia. So he is obviously very upset. He says that Scott Johnson, academic from California, had been working on his PhD in Australia and travelling between Canberra and Sydney universities for his research. So he was living with Noon, but when he went to Sydney, he would actually stay with Noon's parents there. So this is obviously a fairly serious relationship, staying with your other half's parents, living there, having moved from California. And Noon drives through the night to Manly to go and identify Scott's body, which he does. He then drives on to Sydney to tell his parents what's happened. And I believe it's one of Michael's parents who phones Steve, who is Scott's brother in California. Interestingly, they speak to Michael extensively. I believe they speak to Steve. And Scott's death was marked NFA, no further action. And in March 1989, an inquest ruled his death by suicide. Now, his brother, Steve, flies out to Australia to be at the inquest and is incredibly frustrated with this. There's so many things that don't quite add up for him. And it's not that they don't add up and people are talking to him about it. It's literally he's getting nowhere. He's getting no response from anyone. And it's not actually until 30 years later that the police on this case are proved wrong. Scott's brother Steve has worked tirelessly campaigning for justice for his brother. He's written a book, 1,000 Miles from Care, about it. And for years, he gave interviews, he spoke to everyone, he wrote to everyone. This man is sort of a machine. He's got a family. He sold his tech company for millions of pounds. And his main work he sees as having campaigned to find out what happened to his brother. He even offers a $2 million reward for any information. Scott and Steve are incredibly close as brothers. Steve is the oldest. Their parents split when the boys are preteens. They have one older sister. And their mother then has a hard time making ends meet, and the family chip in wherever they can. And the boys are very close. Scott's quiet and shy. I believe Steve is more outgoing. And they are incredibly intelligent. Scott gets a scholarship to Caltech, which is one of the best universities in the States. And while still a student, he begins working at the Jet Propulsion Lab, the scientific arm of NASA that Caltech manages. When he's 21, his pictures of the surface of Venus are shown on the 6 o'clock news. He spends ages trying to work out these pictures, and eventually he sees what they are, and it's just a huge breakthrough. He's 21. He does a 1-year maths program at Cambridge. And when he gets back, he hangs out a lot with his brother. They've missed each other. They spend a lot of time together, and they walk a lot. They walk and talk a lot. And it's then that Scott says to his brother that he's actually gay, and he's fallen for someone at Cambridge. And that someone is actually Michael Noon. And because of his relationship with Michael, he decides to move to Australia in April 1986 to be with him. So Scott returns to the US often. He and his brother seem to have very similar interests. They seem to have very entrepreneurial ideas around technology. It's interesting to me that Steve sells his company to Microsoft, and then he starts up an AI company, and he's got 100 million. He doesn't need to set up another company, but he's obviously just very he's got this thing for tech, and he understands it. And I believe his brother was the same, and they would have liked to have worked together, but obviously they don't. So they travel backwards and forwards to see each other a lot. And Steve is absolutely devastated when he hears of his brother's death, and he is incredibly surprised for loads of reasons. Steve's oldest daughter has just been born, and he knows that Scott is just desperate to meet her and so excited. The North Cliffs is a known suicide spot, which is partly why no one raises an eyebrow. Noon said that Scott had previously thought of suicide on the Golden Gate Bridge, but hadn't obviously gone through with it. Steve's not convinced. Steve's not convinced about any of this. And a couple of things bother him. Scott's wallet isn't there. We don't know where Scott's wallet is. We never find it. He's also very aware, which is something that struck me when I first read about this, there's no such thing as a naked jumper. Now, as far as I'm aware, and I am not in forensics or anything, but people who jump from tall places do not remove their clothes first. And I would go a step further to say that if they did, would they fold them up incredibly neatly? So that's something. He was also very keen to meet his 6-week-old niece. He kept a picture of her under his pillow. He was due to come back and visit her. And he was at the end of his PhD. He'd made a really important discovery. And he was due to meet his supervisor, Professor Street, the Wednesday after he died. So he died on a Thursday night, early Friday morning. The next Wednesday, he was due to meet his supervisor, Professor, and tell him about this amazing discovery. And not only was it like, tick, my PhD's done, but it was like, this is going to be incredible. This is groundbreaking. And he was really excited about that. I know that mental health can take a turn at any point, but he had plans and things to look forward to, and at no point seemed to be struggling with his mental health at all. Now, I know, of course, there are exceptions to this rule, but for Steve, there's just a lot of things that aren't adding up. So Steve flies to Australia to speak to Noon, and then 3 weeks later, he sends the police a 50-page document laying out his suspicions as to why his brother would not have jumped. But he gets nowhere. I believe that at the time, Michael Noon is not unhelpful, but he's sort of resigned to the fact that this is what happened to Scott, and he kind of wants to move on with his life. And so Steve is working to try and find out what happened to his brother from the other side of the world with very little help. That is until 2005, when Michael Noon sends an envelope of clippings to Steve about 3 men who've died in incredibly similar circumstances to Scott in an area which is called in Australia the Gay Beats, which is a place where gay men would go and hang out, have parties, drink, they'd go and hang out and I guess feel comfortable and safe. But the problem with the Gay Beats is you would have people who would deliberately go there to beat them up. There's a second inquest because of this. Steve says, isn't it more likely that something went on because this is a known area for gay men to hang out, and these 3 men, it sounds very similar. So there's a second inquest, and that returns an open finding. So it says it's not suicide. We don't know what it is. And this refers the case to the Unsolved Homicides Unit, where they find disinterest at best. And even though this is 2005, which to me feels very modern, I believe they initially have a woman in charge who really doesn't care about solving these murders. It's the same that you find a lot with any sex workers who are killed, where it's like, well, it's their own fault. Luckily, she's removed from the case, and finally, in 2016, a third inquest returns the verdict that Scott Johnson was the victim of a gay hate attack. And this means that another new team are appointed to the case, and they are really going to get on with it. In May 2020, a man named Scott White, who lived alone with his dog, he's in his 50s and not very mentally capable, is arrested. He was 18 and living on the streets when Scott died, and he's arrested because Scott White, it's very confusing. Scott White's ex-wife sent a letter to the police tipping them off. Now, in 2008, White's ex-wife had read an article about the death of Scott. I believe they were still married then. And she said she knew he used to go, quote, poofter bashing. That's what he called it. And she said, so you did this. And he said, quote, it's not my fault. That stupid C word ran off the cliff. She struggled with this information. She then goes for counselling, and eventually she decides to write a letter to the police. And after a sting operation where White confesses to two undercover police and takes them to the spot where Scott fell, that Scott White is arrested. Steve says he's still not convinced, and I have to say there's stuff unanswered for me that I'm unable to find, that maybe if I was in Australia it would be easier for me to find. It might be my bad driving of Google. But Steve says he finds it hard to imagine that his brother would spend time with White, 9 years his junior, poorly educated, drink problems at the time, and living on the streets. Not, as we know, not what we can take to be Scott's type, which is Michael Noon, who is obviously a musicologist. They met at Cambridge. Maybe it was a bit of rough. We don't know. What I find very difficult is that Scott White says that they went for this walk, there was an altercation, and he punched Scott Johnson, and Scott Johnson fell backwards off the cliff. There's obviously no way that we would be able to tell who had been punched after you've fallen off a cliff from that high up. But what I find very difficult is, why are the clothes folded? Who folded the clothes? If they'd gone for a tryst, which is, I think, understood. I think that maybe Scott White had this issue where he was secretly gay and therefore railing against his truth, if that makes sense. Because why is Scott Johnson naked? If he's punched off the cliff, he's punched off the cliff naked. Who folded the clothes? Where's the wallet? Did Scott White take the wallet? There's just a few things that don't fit together for me. They also walked quite a long way, a long north cliff. It's not the first sort of area for a tryst that they came to. They've walked for quite some time. I believe it was about 20 to 30 minutes. What were they talking about? There are a few things. The folding of the clothes is something that really bothers me. I don't think you rip your clothes off and take time to fold them. I don't think you feel confident standing naked on a cliff in a public place. Now, I know it's nighttime, it's not that public, but do you know what I mean? I think you sort of rip your clothes off and get to it and don't fold them. So did Scott White fold them? Why did he fold them? That I find that very weird. Scott White is sentenced to 12 years in prison. He pleads guilty to murder and he's sentenced to 12 years in prison. This is then overturned. So in 2022, Scott White pleads guilty to murder. He gets 12 years. This is later overturned. And in 2023, he pleads guilty to the lesser charge of manslaughter. And the sentence is reduced to 9 years, which means he could be eligible for parole in 2026. He says he met Scott Johnson in a hotel bar. They went for a walk along a cliff top, had an argument. He punched Scott, who fell backwards to his death, having stopped carefully to remove his clothes and fold them up. There's information missing as far as I'm concerned. It seems like a very bad sentence, really, for punching a man off a cliff, never confessing until you're caught, and all of this. But Justice Wilson points out that the court wasn't sentencing, quote, a violent and aggressive young man, rather a seriously impaired man in his 50s who had been law-abiding for 15 years. And it is clear that Scott White is suffering from some sort of alcohol-induced dementia. So I don't know how that would affect him being in prison. Anyway. In November 2022, a special commission of inquiry began examining suspected hate crimes targeting LGBTQ people in New South Wales between 1970 and 2010. It is now estimated that as many as 80 gay men were murdered in Sydney in the late 1980s in what has become known as the gay gang murders, which is literally gangs of people going up to the gay beats and killing these young men and getting away with it. You know, because of these men simply for being gay, it not being looked into, it just being assumed that he just couldn't handle being gay and he's jumped off a cliff. And it must just be so disheartening for their families at the time, but hopefully this means that this is properly getting looked into and hopefully some justice will be served. And a lot of that is down to Steve Johnson, who just stuck to his guns, not believing that his brother could have jumped for alleged, no apparent reason. And that is the story of the death of Scott Johnson. Pretty horrible, but what I really like is when we find a case that, as horrible as it is, leads to something better. And I believe that, hopefully the gay gang murders will be, some of them at least, will be successfully looked into and solved because of this. Thank you so much for listening. You can get your merch. I've put it back up. Thanks to A for asking me where the hell my merch was so that I could put it back up, because that was on my to-do list for a long time. Just didn't get around to it. I love to hear from you, so you can send me an email, themondaynighreview@gmail.com. Thank you so much to anyone who buys me a coffee, joins the Patreon. It makes everything so much easier, i.e. the fact that I've just quit my job and bought myself a fancy new microphone. Thank you. When it says on Buy Me a Coffee, you've bought me a bag of minstrels, you've actually bought me a tiny, tiny bit of this microphone. So thank you. I really appreciate it. I really love doing this podcast, and I love hearing from you about what cases you're interested in, what books you recommend, what TV shows you recommend, all of that. And until next time, be kind, stay safe, and always check the back seats before you drive.